Hello, class, and welcome to this lecture on Asia on America Screens for American Studies 2033. My name is Dr. Jason Ko. I will be teaching this course for this semester. I know that many of you weren't able to make it to the first class, and so this lecture is going to be mostly a sort of a recap of what we talked about in the first class. Unfortunately, I was hoping that I'd get to meet many of you in class, but that's not going to happen because of the class cancellation, which is too bad, but let's make do with what we've got. This class, Asia on America Screens, is offered by American Studies, as many of you know. And let's see. Okay, let's just do the introduction first. My name is Dr. Jason Ko. I teach on behalf of the Comparative Literature Department, the American Studies Department, and also the Gender Studies program. You can reach me at my email, jasonko@hku.hk. I just want to talk a little bit about admin for the course before we get into the kind of course content. Let's go into the Moodle. Basically, because classes in-person lecture has been canceled, and also many of you weren't able to make it to the first course, what I'll be doing is I'm just going to bump everything down from the first week into the following week. So this week on February 5th, we'll actually be talking about what I covered in the previous lecture. And what we'll be covering is talking about just kind of general admin of the course, also talking about ethnographic film and this concept of Orientalism and its relation to cinema, specifically Hollywood cinema. Okay. And then next week we'll be talking about stereotyping Asia. So this is kind of like the dominant discourse when it comes to discussing representations of Asia on American screens. So, what are the stereotypes that generally are used to represent Asia? Okay, so for that, you'll be watching Broken Blossoms, a D.W. Griffith film. And you can watch that on YouTube. So there's also a link on Moodle. And so also I want you to do the readings. So be sure to do all the readings. Everything's available on Moodle. Afterwards, we're going to kind of, apparently we'll be going on a break. Okay, so from February 19th and February 26th, there will be no class at all. And then I think what's going to happen is likely when it comes to May or end of April and in May, we'll probably have some makeup courses. So we'll see what happens from there. But for now, just kind of stay tuned. So let's get to PowerPoint. So I'll put this PowerPoint on Moodle so you can get it later. Okay. Let's see. Admin. Yeah, we already did that. Okay. Now, I know that video lectures can be a bit boring and a bit long, so I'm going to try to kind of go quickly through this as fast as I can, and then hopefully you can post in the forum. I'll be posting a forum in every module so that you can ask questions, leave feedback, and comment, and that kind of thing. Be sure to ask your questions in the forum so that your classmates can also benefit. So that way I don't have to answer questions multiple times, but also because, we all learn from discussion that everyone gets to see. Okay. So don't worry about, asking the right questions or whatever, whatever question you have, I'm sure that everyone else also has that question, or the majority of people do. So feel free to ask. Okay. With that in mind, if we do have discussions, try to be nice. All right. Follow the norms of online good behavior and good manners. Be nice, don't, keep it a safe space, don't attack people. If you want to argue about positions, not people, or no ad hominem attacks, that kind of thing. Okay. Anyway, and I'll be moderating the forum. I will be moderating the forum. So, and I'll try to answer as many questions as I can. Okay, cool. Let's see. The course schedule, actually, I think it's best that we hold off on guaranteeing the course schedule because there's going to be a lot of adjustments as we go. But for the time being, I'm posting everything on Moodle, like I said before. So for the next 2 weeks, you'll be able to watch everything that you need or all the resources that you need on Moodle. as we go on, I might change things around and that kind of thing. And as for assignments, I'm going to hold off on that too. If you have any recommendations, okay, about assignments, feel free to post in the forums, okay. Originally, we discussed in class about possibly doing some sort of sample analysis, or maybe even doing video essays or short creative films, but I don't know how comfortable you feel about doing that, given that we're not going to be meeting in class. I'd also was hoping that you'd be presenting these, this work to your classmates, but it's very hard to get a gauge of how comfortable you are with doing these kinds of things because I'm just talking to a computer screen right now, and you're just looking at a computer screen hearing me talk, so it's kind of tough. All right, so hopefully we will get a chance to meet in person and talk more then. Okay? All right. So right now then, now that I've gotten through the admin, what I'm going to cover is this concept of Orientalism, and then we're going to talk about its relationship to cinema, okay, and what do Orientalism and cinema have to do with each other, okay, and then we're going to talk about Hollywood as, the filmmaking industry and its representations of China and what that relationship has to do with each other, and lastly, we're going to talk a little bit about ethnographic filmmaking, okay? All right, cool. So the first thing I want to do is I want to show you a short clip from Grass. Grass is the documentary film that I've asked you to watch for class. Okay, so with these screencasts, you can't really you can't record sound when you're playing the video, but you can watch the video. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play this video, a little bit of it, and I'm going to talk at the same time. Okay, and that's okay because it's a silent film anyway, right? Okay, so here we go. So one thing important to understand about this film is that it was made in 1925. Okay, let's see. Paramount is this big studio that's still around. Okay, and what Grass is, and notice the way that it's framed too: a nation's battle for life. Okay, and the three filmmakers is Marion C. Cooper, Ernst B. Schoenbeck, and Marguerite Harrison. Okay, so Cooper and Schoenbeck, okay, I don't really know how to pronounce that name, actually ended up being longtime Hollywood filmmakers. Okay, and they actually made the original King Kong, the one with the kind of giant gorilla, that's climbing up the Empire State Building. Okay, and so if you think about it, how is it that you go from being a documentary kind of filmmaker to someone who makes kind of these movies about giant gorillas attacking a city? Okay, but that's not something that actually it's not that odd if you really think about it. Okay, all right. So I was going to talk about this. Okay, so notice the phrasing. Okay, before we even begin this documentary. Okay, and this is important to understand that this is presented as a documentary, and what they mean by documentary is like these filmmakers actually went to what is modern day Iran, okay, and parts of Turkey, and they shot. And they got footage of these kind of nomadic people who go on this kind of great migration. Okay, and look at the way that they set it up. They say the way of the world is west. Okay, what do they mean by that? Right? What do they mean by the way of the world is west? And it's important to understand that the way that they're setting this up, this kind of story and their filmmaking, is with a certain orientation. Okay, I want you to think about it like, right? So long had the sages have told us how our forefathers, the Aryans of old, so a weird kind of Nazi kind of, not Naziist kind of mythology, rose remote in Asia and began conquest of earth, moving ever in the path of the sun. Okay, so it's always this sense that, we're always moving westward. And the movement west is associated with progress, okay? Conquest and progress, okay? So there's a very strong kind of colonialist overtone about this idea that the peoples rose in the east, and then they move towards the west, and then they conquer and progress as they go with time. So the way of the world, its orientation is westward, okay? And yet they're trying to say, but at the same time, there's, okay. So I should have just been playing this as we're going. And he says the storyline anyway, is we are part of that great migration, this forward Western progressive movement. We're travelers who still face to the westward, okay? And yet at the same time, this story is a story about the people who still, make that migration from east to west. So people who are primordial in a certain sense, okay? Now, I'm not saying that that's true, okay? What I'm saying is that this is the way that it's presented. okay, to the audience. So back in the East, right, behind us are the secrets of our own past and a tradition of our brothers still living in the cradle of the race, a long since forgotten people. So the way that it's kind of mythologized as this kind of group of people who still are moving east to west, okay, who still start in the East and move to the West. So this is kind of primordial origins, okay, these people who are back and old and different from us, okay? All right, so the story is two men and a woman. So these kind of intrepid Western travelers, right, Americans who journey back to the East to seek out our primitive roots and see the ways that the world was before. These explorers, okay? And they want to record this early migration, right? So already there's kind of the setup of this East versus West. This idea that you have these Western peoples who are progressive, who are civilized, who are going to go backwards in time. Okay, not just to a location, but to a different era of, and then it's set up as an opposition of one group who's modern, contemporary, these kind of travelers, right? And then they're going to go and explore and understand these people of the past. So notice, even though this is supposed to be a story about, these nomadic people in Iran, present day Iran, the first characters that you meet are the white people, right? The Western Americans, right? And their journey to the past, okay? So eastward through the hills of Asia Minor, our journey begins, okay? All right. So what do they mean by Asia Minor? Okay, so Asia Minor and Asia Major, okay, is basically what we consider today the Middle East, okay? But in the consideration, and I want you to notice, okay, that it starts with a map, okay? This is very important, right? That this type of filmmaking begins with a map, all right? There's always a sense of how do you orient the viewer? How do you make sure that the viewer understands where they are within this kind of larger scope? So you have to create a map to let them know where they are. Now, it's very important that I wanted us to watch this film, which was only recently rediscovered, I think, in the 1990s. This film from 1925, because what I want you to understand is that this was part, or perhaps maybe even was the first of a very long and ongoing tradition of using cinema for audiences in Hollywood, in the United States, also in Europe, to kind of understand themselves in relationship to this kind of East, okay? So how is it that the West knows itself? It's by mapping out the East and understanding itself. Okay, and this, which is purportedly, technically, it is a documentary, right? It's supposed to be representing itself as a truth, as knowledge about something else, actually provides a way of understanding themselves. Okay, and so this gets to the kind of heart of the matter of not only this film, but also this course in general. Why is it that we're watching a film? Why is it that we're taking a course in American studies about the way that Asia is represented on screen? So ultimately, what I think this course is trying to say, and what I'm trying to argue right now, is that this course is an American studies course, is because if you study representations of Asia on the American screen, you're really doing a study of America. So by studying, and also you can think about it as also America's relationship to Asia, but right now this is just kind of the initial argument I want to make. Okay? So even though this film was shot 100 years ago, you can see a lot of the kind of tropes that you will see in these kind of, filmmaking about, this journey to the East, and studying the ways of these ancient peoples, okay, and, the adventure. And you see that in something like Indiana Jones, and Raiders of the Lost Ark, or, it comes from a very old kind of tradition, okay? All right, so you have these kind of exotic images of things that you would never see before. You have this kind of what I would call and some people have called a tourist gaze, as if the filmmaker is like a what's the word I'm looking for? Like a tour guide. And they're taking you to this place so that you can see it, and it's very, very kind of attractive. And you take on this kind of persona of a tourist who gets to go to the movie theater and see this world that's totally different from your own, okay? And it's exoticizing it. And yet at the same time, even though really this is all being set up as a form of entertainment for you to think of yourself as, oh, I'm going on this journey, to see this other world, it's all kind of staged and set up. Okay, staged in a sort of way to kind of make you feel like you're going on an adventure. Same thing as reading like a fantasy novel or something like that. Okay, and yet at the same time, it's purporting to be news. It's purporting to be not news, but a documentary. You know, the way that the world was before in this other very far away place. Okay, all right. So I want to fast forward to this scene right here of camels, right? It's like of people eating and cooking and this kind of thing. Okay, um, and these kind of like I don't know, like a tour guide movie or something like that is always kind of like, oh, look at the way these people live. Look at the way that they cook. Look at the way they eat. You still see this on Discovery Channel or what is it? These kind of travel shows. Discover the best food Asia has to offer or whatever that you'll see like on cable television at a hotel or something like that. Okay, so this is a kind of long history in American cinema of representing the West. Sorry, representing the East. Western representations of the East. Okay. All right. So this is a very early example. All right. So I'm going to pause it here for now. Okay. So let's get back to the PowerPoint. Okay. So one of the kind of foundational arguments that any course on representations of Asia or representations of the East, is going to be this foundational concept of this notion of Orientalism. Okay, so long before we had, what we would call Asian studies today, or what even an American studies course, right? There were these, there was an academic discipline called Orientalism. Okay, and or Oriental studies. Now, Oriental studies was always based around this idea that you have people in Europe who are studying what is considered the Orient. Okay, and according to this, a lot what people consider the Orient at least that time, hundreds of years ago, is North Africa, the Middle East, and Turkey. This kind of area around the Mediterranean. Okay, now for us in Hong Kong, that's very much west. Right? Let's see. Let's get a map. That's very much west. Okay, right. So we're here in Hong Kong, right here. And remember, even this map, is not representative of the way the Earth really looks. Okay, so that's just this map is made. Okay, and every map, the Earth is a globe, right? So if you use a flat map, it's not going to be an accurate representation. Okay, so this is called a projection. Okay. And the reason they use this one is to keep latitude and longitude as straight lines. But actually, these are not the actual sizes of things. For example, Greenland is not that big. Africa is much, much bigger. Okay, so if you want if you want to learn more about projections and the way that maps represent the world, you can look up projections, like Mercator projection, that kind of thing. Anyway, okay. So people used to think of the Orient as like this area. Okay, now why would they think that? All right. Especially when for us, in Hong Kong, why is it that the East is this when actually that's very, very far west from where we are, right? And that's because the definition of what is East, what is Oriental, is based upon where the people who are doing Oriental studies are based, and they are based here, right? The United Kingdom, what was back then the British Empire, and the colonizing powers of Europe. So basically, the map, right, of orientation, of how they oriented, it was based upon this area right here. And so what they would do is they would say, okay, what's east of us, right? And so that's this, right? And this was also a location of, a lot of different kind of cultural attributes, okay? And was always considered the kind of civilizational other to Western Europe. Okay, so Western Europe, this area. Now, as this kind of academic discipline developed, it was kind of called Oriental Studies, okay? And even now you have schools, right, like in Europe, called the School of Oriental and African Studies, okay? Now, they keep that name just because it's kind of a tradition, all right? But, like even when I was a kid, forever ago, growing up in California over here, people would say it's like, oh yeah, you're an Oriental. I'm like, well, what is an Oriental? Okay, right? So how is it that people whose families maybe are from here, like my family's from Taiwan or something like that, get associated with people who are from here? And that's because we're all Eastern in relation to people who are here. Okay, so Orientalism is an idea that you are orienting oneself. Okay, so it's very important to understand these words such as east, west, orient. Okay, and what's the opposite of orient? Okay, it's the occident. Okay, so let me write these words down for you. Okay, so I'll create yourself. Okay, so you have these kind of binary oppositions. East, west, right, and orient, occident. Okay, so these binary oppositions, what's funny about them is that you can't really know what is west unless you have something that's east of it, right? You can't really know what's east unless you know something's west, right? In the same way, the orient is defined by its opposition to the occident. So let's go back to our map. Okay, so how is it that people in the West can know that they're West? Well, they have to define what is East. Okay. So I remember when I was a kid, and I was taking music lessons, and I asked my teacher, because she had a book that said the history of Western music. I was like, what's the history of Western music? And she was like, oh yeah, that's like music from Europe. And I was like, but we're in California. Europe is east of us, right? And she's like, oh, but it's the history of music, Western Europe is considered, like this area. And I was like, well, why is that considered Western Europe? And what does that mean? It's like, oh, that's because it's opposition to the East, the Eastern Europe. So the East is considered, Western music would be like Mozart or, Bach, Handel, this kind of what we consider classical music, right? And Eastern music would then be music that's, considered Eastern, okay? At the same time, I was like, well, how is Eastern music, why is it called Eastern music if it's west of us, right? So we're in California, it's the West, okay? So if you go west from California, you're going to hit Asia, okay? Or what's considered East, okay? So the point I'm trying to make is that what people consider to be objective locational markers, East and West, okay, is actually based upon its relationship to where you are situated. So if you're and here's the thing about Orientalism is it kind of incorporated the idea that the dominant center from which to look at the world, okay, from which to think about the world, right, the directionality it starts from here. So East is considered what is east of this, okay. West is considered what is and the West is the kind of primary location, right. So then if you think about it in terms of that, then defining where the East is a way of understanding what the West is. Okay, and so the argument that comes up then is that this academic discipline of Orientalism, right, where you study the Orient, is actually a kind of way of really understanding the academics and the colonial institutions and kind of like I guess the colonial society as a way of understanding themselves. So Orientalism can be understood as a way of understanding actually not the Orient or what they call the Orient, but actually understanding Europe. Okay, so in the 1980s, 1990s, a scholar, I think he's Palestinian scholar, Edward Said, came up with this idea of this criticism of Orientalism. And he says that Orientalism, okay, actually is not really a study of, Asia, but really is a kind of way of incorporating and pushing power upon Asia, okay, and deciding and saying what Asia is in order to magnify the power of Europe, okay. And that also includes kind of what we consider the West today, right, like, North America as well. So this is from the reading. So Orientalism. Orientation is a way of coming to terms with the Orient that is based on the Orient's special place in European Western experience. The Orient is not only adjacent to Europe, it is also the place of Europe's greatest and richest and oldest colonies, the source of its civilizations and languages, its cultural contestant, and one of its deepest and most recurring images of the other. In addition, the Orient has helped to define Europe or the West as its contrasting image, idea, personality, and experience. Okay, so first of all, you can't really understand Europe without understanding the Orient because so much of Europe's power, okay, comes from its colonies that were in what is considered the Orient. Okay, so this includes North Africa, it includes the Middle East, it includes India or South Asia. Okay, it wasn't even called India when the British Empire was colonizing it. Okay, Southeast Asia. And also, Eastern Asia, East Asia. Okay, so all of these places have a very long and intricate kind of history with Europe. And yet at the same time, Europe is always trying to say that that is, or sorry, not Europe, but European scholars, especially Orientalists, are always trying to say that this area and the people here and the things that they do is different from us, is other from us. And that's a way of setting Europe apart. Okay, so it's kind of like the way to kind of define oneself is to castigate or study the other. All right. So, and then Said says, yet none of this Orient is merely imaginative. The Orient is an integral part of European material civilization and culture. So he's saying that the Orient is actually European. Okay? Orientalism expresses and represents that part culturally and even ideologically as a mode of discourse, with supporting institutions, vocabulary, scholarship, imagery, doctrines, and even colonial bureaucracies and colonial styles. Okay? So when he says mode of discourse, what he's saying is that if you kind of create a discussion and you focus that discussion entirely on this other place, this place that is used to kind of, by focusing the discussion on that place and defining what that place is and saying it what it is, then you are kind of enacting a power over that place and the people there and telling them what they are in order to solidify your own authority over that group of people. So a very easy way to think about this is imagine that you're in class and I come in as your instructor and I say, I am the authority and I will tell you what you are. You are an A student, you are a B student, you are a C student. Okay? Now, whether or not you are an A, B, or C student, that's not really what matters. What really matters is the fact that I'm the one who's saying what you are. So I am solidifying my authority over you. Okay? So by becoming this person who is knowledgeable about what you are, I'm solidifying my own authority over you. So he's saying that Orientalism then is a sort of form of power. It's a way of controlling this other place by defining it and saying what they are. So, it's quite a strange thing when if you go to a place and they say that, oh, you are this thing. And you're like, oh, I didn't know I was that thing. Right? But it's a way of kind of controlling your power over them, okay? This kind of feeds into things like racism or xenophobia, which we're seeing right now. You may have, Western media, a newspaper in the UK or in, wherever, or social media sites is saying, oh, Chinese people, they do this, they do that, they eat bats, they are unhygienic or whatever, right? And that's really kind of to alleviate their own insecurity and justify, this kind of persecution. Okay? Now, obviously not all Chinese people, eat certain things and, not all Chinese people are this or not all Hong Kongers are this or that, right? But by painting with a broad brush and kind of using these kind of authoritative statements, it justifies this kind of sense of their own power. Okay, so like just like when you're in the schoolyard, and you have bullies, and bullies will make themselves feel better by telling you what you are. Like, oh, you're weak, you're small, you are stupid, you're dumb, right? In order to make themselves feel better, okay, or make them feel like they themselves are more in power. So what Said is saying is Orientalism then can be discussed and analyzed as the corporate institution. Okay, so this is important too, that he's saying that it's a corporate institution. So it's not just individuals who are doing this, but it's something that's been institutionalized. So this type of study, this type of, you could call it name calling if you want, but this kind of defining of the other in order to justify one's own power is something that has been built into all of these institutions and these universities and these knowledge producing kind of institutions. So textbooks, movies, newspapers, discourse in general, okay? Is a form of power over this kind of place. So any Orientalist discourse is one that generates power for the colonials over the colonies. Okay? So Orientalism then can be discussed and analyzed as the corporate institution for dealing with the Orient, dealing with it by making statements about it, authorizing views of it, describing it by teaching it, settling it, ruling over it. In short, Orientalism as a Western style for dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient. So basically, this kind of what's considered to be an academic study, this Orientalism, is in of itself a form of colonialism, a way of kind of enforcing power over this other kind of other groups of people. So then, the images, that get studied in Orientalism are always ones of very, very exotic, very, very, very different, okay? When in fact, and coming across as backwards, when in fact, a lot of civilizational kind of things that you would consider to be, like European or part of European power comes from places like the Middle East, right? Like math or astronomy. Right, and a lot of philosophy too. People like to ignore the fact that some of the greatest classical philosophers are, they're part of what you could call like a Hellenic kind of civilization, but in fact, live in places that we consider to be that are present day, like Turkey or something like that, or what was considered the Orient. Okay. So Orientalism as a mode of discourse and power over. Right. So then, what kind of modes of discourse are there? Right? Yes, obviously there are textbooks, there are university lectures, there's these, professors who come in and say, I will tell you what the East is all about, even though they probably don't speak any, they might not speak any languages, they may never have lived there, so on and so forth. Okay? And they will come in and tell you, tell people who are living in these places what they are. Okay? And another thing too is, like places, it's not like, it also kind of paints with the brush and makes it seem as though these places are actually look like that. Okay, like let's say, for example, right? Like let's just do a Google search. Okay, let's look at a cinematic representation of Shanghai. Or no, let's do Hong Kong. Okay, let's do Hong Kong. What does Hong Kong look like in the movies? Okay, so let's look at some images. Hong Kong in the movies are, I don't know. Okay, let's see. I don't know. Here's a great image, right? Yeah, I don't know, but that's actually from Ghost in the Shell, but I don't know. Yeah, say this for example, right? Hong Kong movies, Hong Kong in the movies, right? But what does Hong Kong actually look like, right? Hong Kong is actually like an urban metropolis. You could even say it's I don't know. Sometimes you could say it's more Western than the West, right? It's so, anyway, whatever. But then if you look at kind of cinematic representations of Hong Kong, you get these junk ships and people doing martial arts and that kind of thing, right? So the idea then is that even cinema then takes part in this discourse. Okay, so when we're watching those clips from Grass, right? Grass is a great example of Orientalist cinema. It's a movie. It's a movie that kind of creates and structures knowledge about this location, the West, and says what it looks like and what it is, and represents it a certain way. When in fact, there's major cities in Iran and in Turkey, Istanbul or Constantinople, or these, enormous cities, that are very, very modern, even in back in the 1920s or whatever. So there's always this sense that, when you take filmmaking, you go to this exotic location and, use it as though it's fact, when actually you could see it as a form of kind of entertainment and authorization of, this kind of superiority. Okay. All right. So what about Orientalism and cinema then? All right. So this is from the Bernstein reading. Western narrative and ethnographic cinemas of the late 19th and 20th centuries inherited the narrative and visual traditions, as well as the cultural assumptions on which Orientalism was based, and filmmakers discovered how popular Orientalism could be. Okay. So you have this long history of Orientalist discourse, in the academy, in literature, in books, that gets extended into movies as well. Right? So in Hollywood, for example, the representations of the East, typically titillating viewers with the thrills of unbridled passion, miscegenation, and wild adventure in a raw and natural setting, whereby the teens, when they say the teens, they don't mean 2010s, they mean 1910s, conventional constructions. So what do they mean by convention? It means it's something that it's so normalized, it becomes a convention of that industry and the type of filmmaking. Right. So, for example, like you could say it's like, why is it that we I know. Here's an example. Why is it that a kind of Western fairy tales always end with, they lived happily ever after, right? Because it's a convention. It's arbitrary, okay? But it has been sort of instituted and become popular, and people are used to it. And so Orientalism became, and is still, I would argue, still a convention of Hollywood cinema. Okay, so this Orientalist discourse, which is a sort of colonizing apparatus, makes its way into filmmaking as well. And Grass is, an excellent example of that. Okay. So Bernstein and these other scholars then are saying it's like, well, then we can use Orientalism, right, as a critique. You can critique Orientalism in this kind of filmmaking. So they say to see Orientalism in film as expressions of colonialist and imperialist cultures, as reworking time-honored genre conventions and psychoanalytic scenarios, as allegories of contemporary politics, as a means of subcultures to rework mainstream films, and as an ideological and aesthetic link between film, literature, theater, and dance. Okay? So you can see, this is an important distinction to make, so let me take the time to explain this. Now, after Said published Orientalism 30 years ago, now when we talk about Orientalism, we talk about as a criticism, as a way of kind of critiquing and understanding, representations, in whether that's in cinema, in newspaper, etc. So Orientalism is a way of, and now when we talk about Orientalist critique, we talk about it as a way of analyzing a power structure that's built into representations. Okay, so this class is at least the early parts of it, okay, and this is a kind of the dominant way of talking about, representations of Asia in cinema, is we're using this Orientalist critique. We're saying, okay, how is it that we can analyze these films as ways of authorizing power, as a way of, subjugation, whether we're seeing it as a form of racism or xenophobia, or also sexism as well. And we'll talk about how those are implicated into each other. So, when you watch a movie, and you see something and you're like, oh, that's really racist against Asians, or you watch a social media clip of, people talking about, oh, like, see how Chinese people, they eat these terrible foods, and it's causing these kind of viruses. Okay. When we say, oh, that's very, very xenophobic, that's very, very racist, and that's, painting everyone with a broad brush, and it's a way of just, making the kind of Western powers think that they're better than others, even though, the flu has caused so many deaths already, and, there's hygiene problems in Western produce, or, my favorite example, okay, sorry, I'm going a little bit over, but sidetrack, is how much of the problems of American health, right, which is, a huge epidemic because of so many kind of problems such as heart disease, diabetes, etc., is caused because of the American diet, right? So the American diet is so bad for you that millions of people are dying, right? And yet the dominant discourse about diet going on right now is that the coronavirus is caused because, the diet of people in mainland China, okay, which is not even true. All right, so that's just an example of Orientalism. And my criticism of that is an example of Orientalist critique. So this is a major methodology that we're using to analyze cinema. Okay, we're looking for Orientalism or examples of this kind of power of the West over people, as a colonial or imperializing kind of institution, and how it structures a sort of power and subjugation through these representations that claim to be objective in some sort of way. Okay, so then, so Orientalism is kind of a mode of discourse, but we're looking specifically at that mode of discourse in cinema. So then why would you study cinema? So this is from Naomi Green. And Naomi Green's book, From Fu Manchu to Kung Fu Panda, goes a little bit beyond the Orientalist critique. Okay, her argument then is not just that you can look at cinema as a way of how the West, specifically Hollywood, and specifically the East, and in this case specifically talking about China or representations of China, is not just that it's racist or xenophobic or imperialist, but also how that these films will demonstrate the relationship and the geopolitical relationship and the kind of politics that are going on between America and China. So as a representation of that and the kind of power, the power relationship between the two. So instead of seeing it as like, oh, this is an objective representation, or seeing it as this is just an example of dominance, and racism, she's arguing that you can see it as a sort of way of understanding the kind of conflict, but also relationship and negotiations and agreements, right, between the U.S. and China. Okay, so she's saying that, and not only, sorry, and this is very important. Okay, so she's saying it's not just as a way of understanding that history, but also understanding the way that it shapes history too. So she's saying that cinema is not just an example of the way that the West has dominated the East, but also an example of how the cinema itself can be a way of shaping that relationship. Okay, so she's saying film is a source in that it reveals not only the physical and social realities of the past, but also the attitudes and beliefs of the period in which it was made. It acts as an agent in a twofold way. So cinema as an archive of history, but also as a shaper of history. So right now, like if you think about it, our kind of the present discourse that we're getting right now in many kind of popular representations of China when it comes to the current novel coronavirus epidemic, is Orientalist. But at the same time, you're getting a lot of anti-Orientalist critique, like the one that I just gave, or I'm sure that you're seeing on social media, that's castigating, many of these news outlets for being Orientalist, for being xenophobic. So cinema then, as also a mode of discourse, can be seen to be shaping the history that's going to happen, okay, shaping these kind of current events. So it's not one thing that's always one way. It's always going back and forth. And it's a way of understanding how it can be shaped in the future. Okay. So there is agency, right? There's resistance. And, there's even arguments to say that perhaps the resistance, or what we call the resistance, is more dominant than what we would consider to be the oppressive factors. Okay. Have you read more arguments about, have you seen more xenophobia, or have you seen more arguments against xenophobia? It's hard to say. Right? And it really depends on what social media streams you follow, of course, All right. So cinema then is a really worthwhile way to think about it and to understand it, especially because there's so many aspects of cinema that you can study, not just what happens in the movies, but also the reception of those movies and how people kind of like it or don't like it, or what they like about it, and also what they write about it, reception to movies, etc. Okay. So, and also then, Naomi Green is able to notice certain trends over time, and we're going to talk about these different trends. Where what she calls it the pendulum. Okay, what she means is a dialectic. Okay, but a pendulum that swings back and forth. Okay, so representations go from positive to negative to positive to negative. Right? China is good. China is bad. China is our enemy. China is our ally. Back and forth. Back and forth. Okay, so she's saying that looking at this history, you can see a relationship going back and forth of public perceptions about the relationship between China and America. And obviously much of that is also influenced by people who have a imbricated relationship between China and America. Many of us, okay, for example, our class right here is spoken in English. You are in Hong Kong, but you're taking a class on American studies. Okay, so it's not like we're completely divorced of each other. In fact, many of you probably have a relation in some way that's very close to America. And maybe a distant relationship to China. I don't know. Okay. So in the case of American perceptions of China, screen images bear on a relationship between two countries, that is China and America, that is as deeply problematic as it is critically important. No country has figured more prominently in recent American history. Since the onset of the Cold War, the presence of China has loomed large in domestic American politics as well as foreign policy. So Naomi Green is saying it's like China and America are not separate. You can't think of it that way. Some people talk about it as like Chimerica, okay? That these are, especially economically, we're so imbricated with each other. For example, like who holds the most American bonds? The Chinese government, okay? The PRC, the PRC government and its treasury owns most of the American treasury bonds, right? So these economies are so imbricated with each other. Okay, and yet it's still changing and constantly, kind of a thing that people are talking about that's very important to understand our kind of global situation, like with trade war, etc. Okay, so then Naomi's saying is that you have lots of representations that go back and forth. So she says that is under the force of changing historical circumstances, Americans tend to swing from intensely positive images of China to those that are relentlessly negative. On the positive side, China is regarded as an ancient and wise civilization, a land blessed with citizens who are intelligent and industrious, peaceful and stoic, devoted to the values of family and other moral teachings of Confucius. But there is another, fearsome China, as a land of Oriental despots, of Genghis Khan and the marauding hordes, of strange practices and barbaric tortures. So that's one of the funny things about Orientalism, okay? And, especially in these kind of studies of Asia and China specifically, is these people and also these representations are saying that this is true, this is what they are. And yet what they are is constantly changing. Okay? And so this constant change is, Neil McGreen is arguing, is representative of the constantly changing relationship between China and the United States. Okay? All right. So let's think specifically about ethnographic film, okay, and documentary. Okay, so going back to Grass, right? So documentary then is something documentaries are not necessarily true, okay? They're nonfiction, okay, but that doesn't mean parts of them are not fictionalized. So a documentary, what makes something a documentary is that it represents itself as truth. It's making an argument and saying that it has something to do with the real world, that is based on the real world in some sort of way. It's purporting to represent actual things. But in fact, right, as you can see from representations in Grass, for example, right, is that a lot of it is staged, okay? So let's see. Let's get an image. Okay, here's a good example of this guy hunting, right? This guy's hunting, and I want you to watch the whole thing, okay? But this guy's hunting, right? And then he looks up here. This is my favorite shot. Okay, so this guy's hunting, and he's hunting in this ancient, way that he does not hunt for sport. He kills for food, right? And this kind of like, oh, this is how these people live, okay? So he's aiming, he looks up and he sees a goat. And he pulls the trigger, shoots. Okay, and then the goat dies. All right. So, what do you see right here? Let's watch this part again. Okay. He goes up. Oh wait, no. Sorry. Let's go back 10 seconds. Shoots. Okay, right there. I don't know if you saw that, right? But that's a cut. Okay. That means that what happened in between is he takes the shot, and then they cut. All right, and then they splice it together. So it's not one continuous motion. He actually shoots, and then someone throws a goat off the cliff. Okay, but this is purported to be actuality. It's purported to be truth. Okay, and if you look at the technology of cinema, like there are these huge cameras. Okay, so what they did here was they shot, right, and then they stopped the camera. Someone throws the goat off, and right when they're about to throw the goat off, they start the camera again. Okay, and then each shot is kind of spliced together in this way. Now these cameras are huge, okay? Like early camera, it's not like your iPhone, okay, where it's this tiny thing. Early cameras are very, very big, right? Look at the early cameras, okay? So everything has to be set up in a certain way, and while they're setting it up, right, these kind of big cameras, they're telling the person, they're telling this guy, where to go? Rewind 30 seconds. Okay, they're telling this guy, don't look at the camera. Act like I'm not there, right? But he's there, so where's the camera? The camera is positioned where we're looking, okay? So there's this big camera, right, that's very hard to move, and they're setting up and staging everything. So even though it's reporting to be the truth as a sort of documentary image, right, it's not like, like you have a camera that's in the wild, actually everything is directed, everything is being told what to do, okay? And yet, if you are in America and you go to a theater and you see this, you're like, wow, I'm seeing the truth, okay? I'm seeing the way that people really live, when that's not how they do it, okay? So even though it's a documentary, it really is a form of popular entertainment. And I think it's a very important thing to understand that these filmmakers went on to be, these very big Hollywood blockbuster filmmakers, making movies like King Kong. How's it that you go from making a movie that's supposed to be a documentary about nomads in, I don't know, the Middle East, I guess. We're really not, like Persia, whatever, okay? That purport to be that, Okay, and then end up making movies like King Kong about this gorilla from this far off exotic island that comes and invades New York. Okay, but at the same time, it seems like a very logical step, right? You look at this, oh, we bring you these exotic kind of things, right? Oh, wow, I make a lot of money from, presenting these exotic things to audiences. Let's just take it another step. Okay. And so an argument that's made about early cinema is that this is all form part of what's called the cinema of attractions. Okay. So hold on, let me take a drink. So the idea behind the cinema of attractions is that actually early cinema, a lot of people used to argue that early cinema was a lot like theater, where people would go in and they look at a stage, and you'd have a stage and people would just kind of watch what happens like it's a play. But the argument that film scholar Tom Gunning makes, and a lot of people have picked up on that since then, is that early cinema was more like a kind of like a magic show, where people would go and they want to see this kind of new technology and they want to see these new things. It's very, very attractive. And the most attractive thing about the cinema of attractions was actually the new technology itself, the actual kind of cinematic process. So what really amazed people, so here's an example, right? What really amazed people was not so much, well, yes, it was seeing things on the screen, right? But it wasn't about the story, okay? It was really about the fact that, oh my gosh, I'm seeing a moving image for the first time. I'm seeing this brand new technology. It's not that different from when Apple reveals its newest iPhone or whatever that has some face unlock or whatever, and you get everyone in the crowd gasping like, wow, look at this new technology. Tom Gunning argues that early cinema was the same. It was all about using cinema to show images moving, and that was what's really amazing. And so the type of images and the type of screen kind of moving pictures that they used were ones of things that are like cinematic oddities, and there were also times advertisements for these kind of companies that are creating this technology. Like Edison, who is one of the early filmmakers, is actually, is not known for being a filmmaker. He's actually, a corporate electronics giant, okay, or electricity. And he was trying to get everyone to start using electricity. And one of the amazing things is like, oh, look what electricity does. It brings pictures to life. And so he would show, his images would be like people from carnivals, doing interesting things like bearded ladies or people dancing, but also, things like an elephant being electrocuted. Things like that. Or, and then in France, like the Lumiere brothers, they would show people show a train moving, or, people leaving a factory. And what was really amazing was not just that, what was really amazing about cinema back then, 100-something years ago, is that you get to see things moving. You get to see these images that you'd never seen before, right? This is a culture where people didn't have screens. So I don't know, you probably don't remember because you were very young, but the first time people had like a touchscreen phone, everyone's like, oh my gosh, look at this touchscreen phone. I want to touch it. I want to see it, right? The same thing with cinema. It didn't really matter what you were doing, what you were seeing. What really mattered was that, you wanted to see the technology itself. So what was amazing about touchscreens and all the kind of games or whatever that people played on touchscreens was you get to swipe back and forth, right? So games like Fruit Ninja, it wasn't really so much that that you care so much about seeing fruit and chopping it. It's more that it was so cool to be able to use the technology to do this swiping back and forth. Okay, that uses that. So you can say that that's like a technology of attractions. So early cinema was the same. It was about showing these kind of images that showcase the technical apparatus. But then at the same time, Tom Gunning would argue then that this kind of attractive quality was also made its way into the sort of content of the filmmaking at that time. So, even today, right, when we go to watch, some sort of action flick or, big budget blockbuster, half of the attraction, right, when you go to watch Star Wars is, you want to see the story, but it's also to see the special effects, to watch it in 3D or see it in some color, right? Or some full screen or whatever, right? So it's the advancements in technology is part of the attraction of the cinema. Okay. Now, at the same time, then using this kind of new cinematic technology, it enabled you to see these attractive things that you weren't able to do, right? So something like going to this far off place and shooting these images of things that you might never have seen before, like a camel or someone making naan bread, okay, is part of the attraction of that cinema, where the story is seen as is kind of secondary, okay, as almost like an excuse or a way to allow you to show off the attractive qualities of the cinema and the footage. Okay, so it's like, why is it that we have a movie that's set in space at a long time, long ago, far, far away? A big part of it too is to be able to show these kind of new special effects, right? Like, like a lightsaber, or a Death Star or something like that, right? It's almost an excuse to show off these new kind of fangled aspects of cinematic technology. In the same way, then a documentary can be seen as a new kind of newfangled way to show off the cinematic apparatus as well. Okay, so let's see. So this becomes a sort of cinematic tradition where going to this far off place becomes a way of popular entertainment. Okay, and also kind of showing off the attractive quality of cinema itself. So as a sort of example of that, then, we were looking at grass, right? Which, you see people doing things like eating, okay? So here's an example of people eating, and it's like, oh my gosh, this is the first time I've ever eaten this kind of food, and it's like this, and this becomes a kind of convention. Sorry, let's go back. Sorry, I rewind too far. Okay. Oh, smoking a shisha, or I guess that's not a shisha, but it's a pipe, okay? But this is what interested people. People wanted to see this because it's like, oh, I get to see something that's totally different from what I've seen before. This is what attracts people. How do these people live, right? Even though this is all staged, right? Okay, and how do you eat the goat? And I mean, I have to admit, these images are pretty interesting, right? It's a very attractive quality. And when this movie was re-released 10 years ago, a lot of people in Iran, modern day Iran, were like, oh wow, this is a way of going back and seeing the way that we were, the way that many of our forefathers lived, et cetera, okay? So how do they cook, and cooking is a big part, right? A big part. Oh, and some kebab, and how do they cook it and that kind of thing. And you still see that today, right? You get a lot of cooking shows like, oh, this is the way that it's been eaten, for so long. So what I'm saying is that this is a Hollywood convention. Is something that takes place, right? And oftentimes in representations of Asia. Okay, so this course then is, going to be a course about representation of Asia on Hollywood screens, right? And I'm going to go so far as to argue that even in representations of Asia on American screens made by Asians, you still get a lot of examples of this particular convention. Okay, and so you see this in a very popular film that's very recent, okay, that also starts off with a map. So you don't get the sound on this, okay? But this is this 2-minute clip, and let's see, you can watch Crazy Rich Asians on your own, right? But it's made in 2018, okay? And yet it still channels many of these conventions of early ethnographic cinema. And even though that this movie making is supposed to be Asian American, right? And you would think that it's a kind of balanced representation of Asian Americans and how they live. It still takes on these kind of Orientalist, and traditions of Hollywood cinema. So we just watch grass, right? And we watch people cooking, and how they live, and introducing this new kind of food in this kind of tour guide way. And you see it as sort of a map. What I want to argue to you today is that even representations today made by Asian Americans who are supposed to be, more equally representative, still take on these kind of like Hollywood conventions. Okay, so here you go. So there's no sound because on a screencast you don't get sound, but at the very least you can kind of see it. Okay, so you got a map of Singapore. Oh, here's Singapore. Okay, and then you start at the airport, right? Your arrival. So it's always structured as a sort of journey to the east. Okay, even an Asian American film, okay, that stars with Asians, right? They're still kind of thinking of themselves as these leaving to this kind of exotic locale. So first you greet the locals, right? And how do the locals live? How do they act? In what ways I guess it's much better with sound. Sorry about that. But yes. So yeah, those of you who have seen Crazy Rich Asians, you know that they're just arriving at the airport, and she's learning about the way that her boyfriend lives. You know, he lives as this exotic, crazy rich Asian. He's not a normal Asian; he's a crazy rich one. You know, but at the same time, you know, even though they're being represented not as primordial or primeval, right? There's still these kind of similar conventions. Now, and it's similar to what Naomi Green is saying, that it's not about the fact that they're represented as positive or negative. It's about the fact that the way that they're represented as different, as something that can be learned from and studied. So yes, so now we're traveling eastward towards this, you know, different location. Now, even though it's represented as positive, it's very important to understand that there's still this sense of this kind of Orientalist gaze that's going on. And what's next, right? Food. Okay, so it's like a travel show. You know, it's like, how do these Singaporeans eat? What do they eat? They eat crab. They eat, you know, and then what languages do they speak? They speak these different languages, okay? So it's this kind of like, it's almost like this kind of commercialization and exoticization of this different location. So yeah, look, naan bread in Singapore, right? What are these different things that they cook, okay? Even though this is a fictional film, okay, made by Asian Americans, you know, it still uses this kind of ethnographic lens to represent Asia, okay? It's been so sort of normalized into Hollywood convention. Okay, and then they all eat, they all get together. Henry Golding is speaking multiple languages, right? And they all get together and live like the locals do. Okay, so there's a very strong sense of this kind of tourist gaze. And this is also part of the attractive quality, right? Why is it that you go to watch this film? It's not just because it's like this romantic comedy, but also because you get to see how different people live and how they enjoy it. Okay? All right, so I guess the argument I'm trying to make is that even today, you still have these kind of Orientalist lens that's going on that relates a film like Grass about these nomads, you know, from Iran, you know, and this intrepid explorers from America who go there to see how they really live. It's not that different from a film like Crazy Rich Asians. They're structured very similarly. The way that they tell their story is very similar, okay? And the reason that they're popular and they're appealing is because they similarly use these types of conventions. Okay, all right, so that's it for today's lecture. The kind of, I'm going to leave these in the PDF so you can see some of the clips of the other films we're going to cover. So we're going to talk about war films. You already watched Grass, right? We're going to talk about films about documentaries about kind of the relationship between Hong Kong and China. This is a recently Oscar-nominated film, American Factory. So we'll be watching that too. We're going to be talking about memory and remembering war, and we'll talk about some films about the Vietnam War. We're gonna, for the lecture in 2 weeks, I want you to watch The Good Earth, right? And also we'll talk about Hong Kong and the World of Susie Wong, which is an American film about Hong Kong. Okay, all right, so that's it for now. I'm gonna try. I know I talk a little bit too much, so I'll just cut it for now. So please continue doing the reading for next week's lecture. Please watch Broken Blossoms. Okay, and next week we'll start talking about watch Broken Blossoms. We'll start talking about stereotypes. Okay, so not just talking about the kind of discourse overall and the way that discourse does, but the particular representations. You know, whether that's of the yellow peril, of damsels in distress, and we'll be talking about that. Okay, all right. So do the readings as well. All right. So take care. Wash your hands. Stay safe, and I know that during this time of I don't think that's a word. During this time of chaos, of disruption, try to continue with your education, and I'll do my best to, keep up with you as well. Any questions that you might have, leave it in the forum that I'm going to post in Moodle, and let's talk. All right. Okay. I'll see you later.